Often when we play chess, we forget something that's absolutely essential. Unless we're playing against a machine or a computer, there's a human in front of us. What does that mean? That they'll have their own ideas, their moves, their sacrifices, their plans, which we won't know for sure. We can guess, but we won't really know. That's why today I'm bringing you one of my games. I love sharing my own games, not because I think I'm better than anyone, far from it. In fact, I have a lot of things I need to improve on. The thing is, no one, absolutely no one knows better what was going through my head in that game. Better than me, right? That's just how it is. If we put ourselves in my opponent's shoes, I can guess what he was thinking, but I can't know for certain exactly what was on his mind. So I'm bringing you a tournament game I played just yesterday, and I'm not going to tell you who won until the end of the video, because that way we keep that sense of suspense, right? The idea is that I started with the king's pawn. I really like starting with the king's pawn, although I can also start with d4 and knight f3. Lately, I've been starting almost every game with my king's pawn, and my opponent surprises me with a Caro-Kann. Now, I was really in the mood for a fight, a battle, meaning I wanted them to play, say, e5 or c5 and have a very open position, but my opponent played the Caro-Kann. Well, it's like I said, right? You have to adapt to whatever your opponent plays. In that case, well, since they're not taking the center, I thought it's the perfect time, right? To put my two pawns on e4 and d4, which is what we always recommend when your opponent doesn't occupy the center immediately. d5 is the theoretical move, and here there are several possible responses, such as the advance variation or the exchange variation. And knight c3 or knight d2? Well, in this case, I went with knight c3. Those of you who've been on the channel for a while know I played a tournament game about, what was it, a year ago? Where I was playing with the black pieces and was also very well prepared with the Caro-Kann against an opponent who played knight d2. Actually, the variation ends right there, because after pawn takes pawn, we have to recapture with the knight. And whether it was on d2 or c3, the position was the same. Okay, here the theoretical move is knight f6. Well, let's just say, I prefer this bishop f5 because it poses several problems for your opponent. They can't defend the knight with the bishop because this pawn would fall. So, well, there are several interesting moves here, like queen f3, attacking this bishop, and then defending the pawn with c3, for example, or even just retreating while attacking this bishop. But anyway, my opponent plays knight f6, which is as solid as it gets, where the best move is to exchange, and we find ourselves in an opening that's just begun, but it has certain characteristics, right? For example, we've already traded a pair of knights. All four bishops can go wherever they want, and that's very interesting. We'll see that now we must start thinking about what we move and where. We have so many possibilities that we really must try to find a good one, right? There are surely several good ones. Based on the theory I knew that the best move here might be to play c3, waiting for my opponent to react. In fact, I'd love to play bishop d3 first, but it's not possible now because I'd lose this d4 pawn. Therefore, I still can't place my bishop on the square I want, so c3 would be a good move. In this case, I say, well, I'm going to place my bishop on c4, occupying a good diagonal. The diagonal that points directly to this weak point on f7, you shouldn't worry about black's position. Since these doubled pawns don't seem to be a very big weakness, they'll just defend the castling very well. And now I say, well, I'm going to wait and see what my rival does. My opponent plays bishop d6, and whenever there are these types of structures in the French and the Caro-Kann, where pawns have been exchanged on the king file, this queen e2 check is usually a very interesting move to consider. Why? Because now you pose right a doubt to your rival. What do? I'll rule out moving the king, right? I can't cover with bishop e6 because after the exchanges, I'd lose a pawn and it'd be a free pawn. Well, I'd give check and the position would be a bargain for me. So he only has two options, either block with the queen or block with the bishop. If he blocks with the bishop, he's retreating the bishop he already moved previously, and therefore that would suit me very well, right? It'll be fabulous. And if he plays queen e7, which is correct, then I'm going to exchange queens. It's true that it might seem that if we exchange queens quickly, we're already sensing a slightly more dr-wish game where it'll be a bit harder to progress. But there's still some substance, right, in the game, because we precisely have two bishops and a knight, and logically the rooks, and anything can happen. My opponent took with the king. Well, gee, yes, good move. Why? Because really, once there are no more queens on the board, the king plays a vital role, and staying in the center isn't usually very dangerous. Besides, you can always play rook 8 and hide the king, and the king is fine. The idea is that if he took with the bishop, he was retreating the bishop, and not only that, also giving me this diagonal. With bishop f4, and my two bishops are clearly superior to the opponent's two. So, well, interesting solution to take with the king, right? I didn't want to develop my knight via f3 because there was always this type of move that bothered me. He was already threatening to double pawns here. And I'll tell you one thing, if you let yourself be captured here, this game is practically impossible to win. This pawn structure will be indefensible, and even more so in an endgame like the one we'd be in. That's why I developed my knight via e2. Thinking the following, if he came through here, which would be a bad move now, I play f3 and he'd have to retreat. Besides, this knight is supporting a bishop f4 that will be able to fight against this bishop. And once they're exchanged, notice that my position would be quite a bit better than my opponent's, right? So here, let's put the pieces back as they were. My opponent decides to make a very interesting move, right? Which is bishop e6, trying to exchange my good bishop for his bishop that wasn't doing anything. In this case, many of you would say, well, I'll just trade and continue with development. Let's see. Trading doesn't seem like the best idea. And do you know why? Because if we trade here, we're fixing the opponent's structure. We'd really be in an extremely equal position where we can't make our tiny development advantage prevail. So I prefer to keep my bishop. Hey, in the future, we'll move it again. The good thing about bishops and knights and pieces that aren't pawns is that they can move back and forth as many times as they want, right? You have to be much more careful with pawns since they can't move backward. That's why we've simply advanced one, the other was exchanged, right? Very well. After this move, my opponent plays rook e8, trying to do an artificial castle and trying to, through x-rays, target my king. That's why I castle immediately. Well, I didn't want any trouble, obviously. And now here, in my view, and everything I say is always from my point of view, my opponent makes a small inaccuracy which is placing the knight. On d7, watch out. He's not going to lose because of that. I'm just saying it's a small inaccuracy because it allows us to win the bishop pair, right? This bishop has no way out right now, and with knight f4, we're going to win it. The idea is that if he doesn't want to lose it, he'll have to give up his other bishop. And it would be even worse because when he gives it up, we'd enter with this other one. Through f4, we'd win this diagonal, right? So let's see, he can't go here because the bishop is there. He couldn't come this way because a simple h3 would make him retreat to this square and we'd capture it. Therefore, he can't come this way. And on the other side, he can't go anywhere either because everything is defended, right? That's why my opponent calmly decides to move the king and accepts that he's completely surrendered and lost the bishop pair. I have nothing better to do than capture the piece, and in fact, even though I could make any other move and this bishop still couldn't be saved, I decided to capture it immediately. To continue with my development, and not just for that, but because here I pose a question to my opponent. Upon capturing, he has two options, capture with the pawn or capture with the rook. Capturing with the pawn will be losing on the spot. Let me explain. Throughout this moment, I'm sure you're seeing that I can capture the pawn on h7. Well, the pawn on h7 is actually usually a poisoned gift. For example here, if he captures with the rook, which is what my opponent did, I can't capture this pawn since a simple move like g6 would trap it for us, and this bishop is going to be captured and would lose it entirely. So here, if he had captured with the pawn, it would indeed be possible to capture this pawn, since it couldn't be trapped. Therefore, capturing with the pawn here would be a disaster, right? My opponent captures with the rook. Here, I'm thinking for a bit, and I say, well, I'd like my opponent to bring the other rook. I'm going to make a waiting move, like bishop e3, and see if my opponent makes the mistake of bringing the other rook. Why would it be a mistake? Because we would simply win this pawn. I know. First by threatening the rook. Let's see, chess teacher, you're telling me that if I capture this pawn, they trap it, but there's a little trick here, which is first I attack the rook, I force him to come defend the knight, which is also under attack, and now I could actually win it. So they couldn't trap it because then we would deliver checkmate. Do you see that little trick right here? So that's why I decided to make this waiting move, bishop e3, to see if my opponent does the logical thing and brings the rook to double up with his other rook. Of course, my opponent wisely realizes all this and decides to play the move h6, which, while not being the most precise, obviously he's not going to lose that pawn. And what he's doing now is trying to bring the other rook to double up and get active. All right, we've reached the point in the game where, yes, I have the bishop pair, everything looks very nice, but I don't see how to progress either. My idea is to bring the rooks to the center. I bring this one to dub one. I don't like placing this rook on e1 for now because simply after doubling up the rooks, it would be very difficult to defend against this bishop later. Once they attack it, I'd have to retreat to d2 because otherwise I'd lose the rook. There could be exchanges and this would probably already be a draw. That's why I decided to bring the other rook, which isn't doing anything at all, and I place it now, trying to create a very big threat. What would the threat be? Well, let's assume again that he makes a logical move like this one here. You can watch the explanation as many times as you need. Let's assume he makes this logical move. Well, my threat, do you know what it is? For example, I could advance this pawn. Once the exchanges happen, I could come through here, threaten the rook, then I'd enter with this other rook, double up on the d-file, and you can see that this is very, very dangerous for my opponent. Suddenly, my bishop pair and my rooks on the d-file would really be extremely strong. That's why that obviously, let's put this back where it was, he can't make a quiet move like this, because otherwise he'd get into serious trouble. My opponent plays knight e6 against me, probably the best move in the position. I must tell you something that speaks well in our favor in this game, that we both exceeded 95% accuracy. This is spectacular, at least for me. I understand that probably some of you are used to it and are very strong players who exceed this level of accuracy. For me, it's an excellent achievement. The idea is that now this knight, logically, you know what it wants, to jump to the d5 square from where it would be controlling the whole board. It would be threatening our bishop pair, and therefore it would be performing, well, super well, right? He'd be super happy, while on d7 it did nothing because we were shielding it, right? Here I play c4, practically mandatory. It defends the square of d5, and well, it poses the threat, especially also of advancing the pawn to make a fork. Logically, this isn't going to happen, right? My opponent plays bishop c7, and I had this in mind. Logically, I had to think what happens if my rival comes to take a trip through here. It doesn't seem so easy in this case, because he's threatening his pawn. I had to calculate what happened if after b3 came through here, because if I move the rook, I'm going to lose the bishop. I'm losing the bishop pair in exchange for a knight that was doing nothing. I had to evaluate this well. However, well, after this move, I could really always play, for example, a rook d2 and defend through here. It's true that he could come in with the bishop, but I could hold my ground in a solid way. Then, after kicking out those pieces, I think I would be left in a very good position. But logically, all of this has to be calculated before moving the c4. Once I move this c4, my rival plays bishop c7. And now, well, I'm using a very interesting plan, which is the following. Bishop 4. I spent a while thinking here, and the engines, well, they like this move, but they say there might be a better one, right? Well, the idea of bishop 4 is that now, if he retreats, I'll open with d5 and try to cause serious problems for my opponent. For example, a move like this, right? I'm threatening to advance and also enter through here. These bishops are extremely dangerous. If he comes to e8, it's practically the same. So here my opponent, after thinking for a long 20 minutes, decides to make the best move in the position, which is to give up the rook for the bishop. Well, super interesting. Had I evaluated this? Of course I had. However, I thought that when they give up the exchange, there are usually several objectives. One is to attack immediately, and the other is to win back 2 pawns. You already know that when a rook is given for a minor piece, whether a bishop or a knight, they must also capture 2 pawns to equalize the material. I already knew that here they were going to win one back, and they'd be threatening me with 2 more. For now, I could defend this one without a problem, and if he captured the one on b2, I had this rook b1 attacking over here. Well, all of this would have to be played out because it's not that easy, you know? But, well, at least if he wins it back, we're equal on material, right? If he wins it back, we're equal on material. The knight was here, right? Yes. At least, well, I say I'm going to defend. My opponent says, well, I'm going to keep pressing you, and now I have a dilemma here. And I thought, if you come with the king here to defend, this one can always fall. And when you advance, be careful they don't sacrifice here. And when you take, they don't take here, attacking here and here. Well, I was a bit afraid. I'm not going to lie to you. Whenever there are these types of sacrifices, there's always counterplay, right? And this knight, well, the truth is that it's very strong. The idea is that I say, well, you know what? For now, I'm going to defend with rook d3. I didn't like e4 either, because then he would start to pressure me here too. He could start to pressure me along this diagonal, and I didn't want to play e4 at all, right? Although, well, you'll see that I'll have to do it soon anyway. First, I defend with this rook d3. My opponent kicks out the bishop. Maybe the most precise move would have been bishop h3, although I prefer to play this bishop g4, forcing the advance of these pawns a bit to be able to position myself well at f3. However, this f4 move, even though it seems like it does nothing, is actually quite dangerous. I was considering bishop f4 more here. It seemed a bit stronger to me. I can't capture it because my rook falls. If I advance, the pawn is right here controlling this square, right? My king is left a bit unprotected, and that's really the one I was considering. But, well, I could always try to stop everything, right? My opponent plays f4, and I think I have no choice but to advance, since if I capture, I lose the rook, and if I stay still, I'm gonna lose material, right? So, I'm gonna advance. What happens when you advance? Is that you leave this diagonal at the opponent's mercy, quite literally. Of course, I find myself in a situation here where I say, yes, I have a tiny material advantage, tiny, but in exchange, my opponent has quite a bit of activity. Throughout the game so far, we were extremely even, huh? In terms of evaluation. Plus 0.3 minus 0.2 plus 0.5 at most, okay? A very tight game and very much about maneuvering. In this case, after this advance and the placement of a better diagonal for the black bishop, I decide it's time to act, right? I'm going to lose a pawn no matter what. If I don't lose this one, I'll lose one of these two with the attacks along the diagonal and the rook. And I decide, well, at least I'll play this b3, and now let my opponent decide if he wants to place his knight on a good square like this one on e3, if he prefers to do the double attack. For example, over here with this 95, where he attacks my rook and my bishop. Honestly, I say, well, let him do what he wants. Both are really good, right? Either here or here. If he comes here, my idea was to retreat, and after the exchanges, take with the pawn. And surely after that, I'll lose this pawn with rook d8. Yes, I'm aware I was going to lose the pawn, but here, anyway, with this 93, I'll end up losing a pawn, which is what happened in the game, right? Well, first of all, I try to destabilize this pawn here, which is really the key now. If they decide to cover here, well, I'll make the exchanges. These two pawns end up looking terrible, just like this one, and, well, who knows? In an endgame with an exchange up, or an exchange against a bishop and two pawns, I'll be able to eliminate these pawns with the rook, right? Obviously, my opponent, since he was playing with excellent precision, makes the best move in the position. He doesn't capture me, but first he threatens the rook and threatens this point. I have to defend it, there's no other way, and now he exchanges. Good idea, because if not, I'm going to capture, right? If he captures here first, I'm going to capture here. So what does he have to do? Exchange first. Here I was weighing what to do first, but without a doubt, the best thing was to capture first. Why was I weighing it? Because this king here is in a terrible spot, because it's right in the middle of the pin. I thought, if he captures me, maybe I'll bring the king around here. I thought, if I lose this one and this one, I'm still down a pawn. So I'll capture here, and now when you capture this one, which is what he did, rook d8, it could be captured immediately, because after rook takes, rook d8 could come, taking advantage of the pin, but, well, rook d8 is the most human, right? He comes to directly attack this point with three pieces, taking advantage of the pin. I'm going to lose the pawn no matter what. Here I make the best move of the position, luckily, and I only had, if I remember correctly, 4 or 5 minutes on the clock. I didn't have much time to think. King h1, moving the king white. This is very interesting, because this king probably, it might seem like it has better squares to move away from the pin, but they are extremely dangerous. For example, the two that seem best, which would be g2 and f1, are within range of this knight jump in the future. And this can be extremely dangerous, right? Because after, for example, bishop takes, we couldn't recapture. Or after rook takes, we couldn't recapture because the rook falls. That's why I have to decide between these two. And if I have to decide between these two, well, I prefer the white square one. Since my opponent's bishop is on the black squares, well, king h1, my opponent must capture this pawn. He can't capture with a bishop, a huge mistake, because I would simply go back with the rook and this knight would have to move, and when it moves, I'd take the bishop, so he'd lose a piece. He has to capture with the knight, which is what he did, right? He captured with the knight. Fine. In this case, well, they're simply attacking this point. I come to defend it with the king, thinking, let's see if he gets too clever. And with little time on the clock, he captures the bishop without thinking he has the rook defended. But obviously he can't, because I have two rooks, right? And against knight takes bishop, I'd win immediately with rook takes rook takes, and when the king moves away, I'd simply bring the rook and I'd be in an endgame. An advantageous one, I think, right? In this case, King e7. Now the rook is well defended. My opponent played very well. And here, with little time on the board, I was realizing that he could have dangerous threats. For example, with knight takes in the future, it could be dangerous unless I captured with the king, right? Well, to avoid problems, I thought, you know what I'll do? I'll bring the rook to f1. I don't have problems anymore, because if he captures me, I can capture with both rooks. And if not, well, I can always also project myself into the attack against this f7 pawn, right? And my opponent here does the following. First, he plays this h5 to better place his pawn structure and prevent my bishop from progressing along that diagonal. I play b4 to see if I'm in time to play a4 and a5 if he gets distracted, make this bishop move, and I can at some point capture the knight at some point, right? Who knows? And my opponent here, well, they just decide to capture this bishop. Well, I have three options here. Capture with this rook, capture with the king, or capture with this rook. Or what I did in the game. First, rook takes rook, and I'll explain why. The logic might seem to be this one here. Doubling rooks and attacking this point here. Well, the reality is that they're all just as good and lead to a very DRA-wish position, right? The idea is that here they can enter with the rook on the 7th. The king will have to move because I can't block with the rook. They're going to capture this pawn. Well, I'll be able to enter, it's true, but it'll be a position where we'll start capturing pawns, and this endgame won't lead anywhere. So here I say, you know what? First, I trade rooks, they're forced to capture there. I move the bishop, and now I capture, either with the king or with the rook. In this case, I capture with the rook to be able to move it quickly, either through this square or this other one, to give some checks, I don't know, do some mischief with the rook. And here my opponent, well, quickly brings the king to the center. I attack the bishop. The bishop, I expected it to come here to attack, but, well, I could have defended it. My opponent comes this way. It's true that I could go and poke at that pawn, but we wouldn't do much either, right? I bring the king, I say. Let's see if my opponent makes a mistake with few minutes on the clock. You always have to keep that in mind. And he brings the king to the center and lets me enter the 7th, and I'd be winning the game immediately, because when the bishop moves, I'll take pawns, and even if we're equal on material, it could be dangerous. And here, my opponent plays b6, to which I, being a team championship, ask my team captain how we're doing, and he tells me that with a draw, we win the match. So here, I see a very simple draw line, which is this rook c3 attacking the pawn. It can't advance because it's lost. He must come to defend it with the king. He could come this way, but I'd have these kinds of sacrifices with check. Then I'd enter with the rook. My opponent doesn't want to complicate things. I give the check again. He can never block because I'd win the bishop. So again, he has to come here. And so we agreed to a draw here by threefold repetition. And the truth is that it was a game that could really seem very dull, but it had its substance. When the knight came in here, what activity all of a sudden, considering how well I was doing with the two bishops. But, well, sometimes we're not as well off as we think, right? It was a very, very, very equal position where surely the engines would have been able to win, but I'm not a machine. What'd you think? Do you like me explaining games like this? Well, I actually love explaining them when they're mine, especially because I know exactly what I'm thinking, you know? Like I'm telling you. Well, by the way, here comes the promotion part of the video. I often include promotions. You know that whenever I promote something, I recommend it 100%. I assure you that I will never in my life promote something that I don't believe is good. I assure you, since I have a very large platform and I would never dare to do that. So I always promote the best to you. When I promote boards, they're the best ones, okay? And in this case, the app that for me, honestly, is currently the best for studying because it has everything. The app is ChessMind. I'll leave it as always in the description. It has its free trial. Well, more than a trial, it has free features and it has paid features. You can get by perfectly with the free ones, but obviously the paid ones are much better, but like everywhere else, right? You can train your chess openings really well, practice them, plus you can do middle game quizzes. Positional strategy ones, honestly, it's significantly miles ahead in my opinion of any current app. As always, I'll leave it right down here in the description. And soon, I'm going to announce something that, believe me, will fascinate all of you who are subscribed to the newsletter. Well, you'll be the first, as always, to find out about everything. I hope you love this video, and we'll see each other tomorrow in the next one, friends. Bye.